On 18 November 1942, high above Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, an unnamed pilot of the Imperial Japanese Navy gripped the controls of his A6M-0 as he observed an unfamiliar sight climbing rapidly from the American-held airstrip. The aircraft approaching him were the unusual twin-boom fighters of the United States Air Forces, machines the Japanese had taken little interest in until that very moment. That day marked a turning point. The aviators of the 339th Fighter Squadron initiated what would become the first engagement in which P-38 Lightnings confronted Japanese fighters, a clash that challenged long-held assumptions within the Japanese air arm. The Zero pilot later recounted to his superiors at Rabaul that the American aircraft rose from sea level with a speed and steadiness that contradicted everything he had been trained to expect. Japanese intelligence had long dismissed the P-38 Lightning as an overweight, slow-responding design, an aircraft unsuited for close combat. Yet the spectacle unfolding through his canopy told a different story. The Lightnings were ascending with a performance profile that his Mitsubishi A6M2 simply could not duplicate. For the previous 3 years, whether over China, the Philippines, or at the outset of war during the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Zero had been considered unmatched. Its celebrated maneuverability and strong climb characteristics had given Japanese pilots a sense of complete technical superiority over their adversaries. But the battle above Guadalcanal revealed a weakness that had gone largely unrecognized: the Zero's difficulty operating effectively at higher altitudes. During this initial skirmish, the Lightnings of the 339th Squadron claimed 3 Japanese aircraft, employing tactics based on altitude advantage rather than traditional turning duels. From heights the Zeros struggled to reach, the Lightning pilots dictated the engagement, rendering the Zero's agile, low-altitude fighting style nearly irrelevant. What unfolded over the island was more than a single encounter. It was the beginning of a fundamental shift in the Pacific Air War. Japanese air doctrine had been built on technical presumptions that were suddenly proving unreliable. The equations of air combat superiority were being recalculated in real time, not in classroom lectures or training manuals, but through the hard evidence of a twin-engine fighter outperforming a symbol of Japan's early war dominance. The crumbling of an assumed superiority. Japan's aura of aerial invulnerability had begun to erode well before anyone in the Imperial Navy recognized it. Since 7 December 1941, Japanese naval aviators had roamed across the Pacific with confidence rooted in their early victories. The A6M-0, combining long-range, exceptional turning radius, and a cadre of highly trained pilots, had built a formidable reputation. With a top speed of roughly 332 miles per hour at optimal altitude, and the ability to outturn virtually every Allied fighter of the early war, it seemed an unbeatable opponent. Among the pilots credited with cementing this reputation was Petty Officer First Class Saburo Sakai. A combat veteran from the campaigns in China, Sakai had survived numerous engagements and accumulated an impressive record, claiming 13 victories during the Borneo operations alone before being reassigned to Lae, New Guinea, where he secured the majority of his eventual 64 credited victories. His confidence in the Zero mirrored that of the Japanese pilot corps at large. His superior officer, Lieutenant Junichi Sasai, briefed his men with an assurance reflective of the period. The American aircraft operating over Guadalcanal, he believed, were almost certainly carrier-based Navy fighters, likely the F-4F Wildcat, a type the Japanese had already defeated repeatedly in earlier encounters. Throughout the early months of 1942, those expectations seemed justified. The Zero appeared to stand alone in its class, and the Imperial Japanese Naval Air Service operated with a sense of certainty shaped by continuous success. But the arrival of the P-38 Lightning over Guadalcanal signaled that this era of unchecked dominance was beginning to close. The events of that November morning, unremarkable at a distance yet monumental in implication, marked the early stages of a strategic shift that would continue to accelerate as the war progressed. In the opening months of the Pacific War, Japanese aviators found themselves cutting through Allied air units with disturbing ease. Outdated Brewster Buffaloes fell in numbers above Singapore. Curtiss P-40 Warhawks were overwhelmed across Java, and Royal Air Force Hurricanes proved powerless in the skies over Burma. During this period, the A6M-0 enjoyed an almost unchallenged reign. Even when confronted with newer Allied aircraft, Japanese flyers, hardened by years of continuous service in China, retained a psychological advantage grounded in strict discipline, intensive pre-war training, and tactical doctrines tailored to maximizing the Zero's strengths. Yet, by mid-1942, rumors circulating through intelligence channels began describing a different kind of American fighter. Reports spoke of a machine with two engines, a twin-boom fuselage, and a battery of weapons clustered in its nose. Many Japanese squadron leaders dismissed these accounts outright. The prevailing belief was that an aircraft with two engines could never compete with the Zero's agility. Japan's naval air strategy, built upon the ideal of the decisive dogfight and the superiority of the individual pilot, left little conceptual room for a radically different style of combat aircraft. The arrival of the Lightning. The machine hinted at in those intelligence briefings was the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, the only twin-engine fighter of the Second World War to achieve true success in daytime air combat. Its origins traced back to a February 1937 U.S. Army Air Corps requirement for a long-range, high-altitude interceptor. Under Chief Engineer Clarence G. Kelly Johnson, Lockheed developed a design that departed dramatically from conventional fighter layouts. The P-38 was capable of exceeding 400 miles per hour, reaching 40,000 feet, and carrying enough fuel for missions extending over 1,000 miles, capabilities that were astonishing to Japanese engineers who had prioritized lightweight and extreme maneuverability above all else. With a pair of Allison V1710 engines, each delivering roughly 1,150 horsepower through turbo superchargers, the Lightning embodied an opposing design philosophy: protection, speed, altitude, and concentrated firepower. Unlike early Model Zeros, which lacked armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks, the P-38 was built with pilot survivability in mind. When the first Lightnings reached Australia, however, they did not immediately enter combat. Mechanical shortcomings and unanticipated maintenance challenges forced a delay. But by the latter months of 1942, engineers had corrected the most critical issues, and squadrons flying P-40s began transitioning to the new fighter. Among them were the men of the 49th Fighter Group, whose bitter experiences against Japanese aircraft had taught them the fatal folly of attempting to turn with Zeros. The P-38 offered the possibility of fighting at altitudes and speeds where the Zero was weakest. First combat over the Solomons. The Lightning's true debut came on November 18, 1942, when the 3rd 39th Fighter Squadron, flying from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, escorted B-17 Flying Fortress bombers and encountered Japanese fighters. What followed surprised both adversaries. Japanese pilots, initially uncertain what the unusual twin-boom silhouettes represented, assumed they were seeing reconnaissance machines, or possibly light bombers. Their confusion deepened as the aircraft climbed far faster than anything fitting those roles. When they finally recognized them as fighters, the P-38s had already claimed an altitude advantage of nearly 5,000 feet. This superior positioning became the cornerstone of P-38 tactics. The Lightning could operate comfortably above the altitude ceiling where the Zero performed well, allowing American pilots to dictate the terms of engagement. High above the dogfight arena where the Zero excelled, the P-38s used their speed to launch diving attacks that the Japanese fighters struggled to avoid. A technological divide. Though the Zero was unmatched in slow-speed maneuverability, its weaknesses at higher velocities were profound. Beyond 250 miles per hour, its control surfaces became heavy and resistant. Past 300 miles per hour, the aircraft's responsiveness deteriorated sharply, making evasive maneuvers extremely difficult. The P-38, particularly in later versions with hydraulically assisted controls, remained manageable even when plunging toward 500 miles per hour. For Japanese aviators, the Lightning did more than introduce a new opponent. It revealed an entirely different strategic mindset. American engineers and tacticians were shaping air combat around altitude, speed retention, long-range operations, and concentrated firepower, concepts that had not been central to Japanese aerial doctrine. The Zero, designed for tight dogfighting and short engagements, was ill-equipped for this new paradigm. The arrival of the P-38 marked the beginning of a shift in the Pacific Air War. It was not only a formidable machine, it was a sign that the technological balance, once solidly in Japan's favor, was beginning to tilt. The Lightning carried its offensive strength in a configuration that immediately set it apart from most fighters of the era. Instead of spreading weapons across the wings, all of its armament, 4 50-caliber machine guns paired with a 120mm cannon, was mounted in the aircraft's nose. This arrangement concentrated its fire into a single, tight stream that remained accurate at longer distances and eliminated the elaborate convergence settings required by wing-armed aircraft. For pilots on the receiving end, the effect was often catastrophic. Equally transformative was the P-38's power plant system. Its turbo-supercharged Allison engines operated in a performance category that Japanese aviators were unfamiliar with. Because the turbochargers maintained power at altitude and dampened exhaust noise, the Lightning not only climbed efficiently at high levels, but also ran with an unexpectedly muted acoustic signature. Many Japanese pilots remarked later that they rarely heard the aircraft approaching until it was already in firing position. The contrast with the Zero was stark. The Nakajima Sakae engine, which produced around 950 horsepower at sea level, bled power as the aircraft climbed. By 20,000 feet, the engine was struggling to deliver even 750 horsepower. In vertical engagements, this disparity was unforgiving. The P-38 held its strength as it went higher, allowing American pilots to dictate when and where a fight occurred, while Japanese pilots increasingly found themselves unable to match climbs, dives, or sustained high-altitude maneuvering. The growing psychological weight of technological disadvantage. By the beginning of 1943, evidence in Japanese squadron diaries, letters, and internal reports revealed a worsening emotional strain. The long-cultivated legend of the Zero as an unmatched dogfighter, born during its early victories in China, was starting to collapse under battlefield reality. Pilots wrote of flying in a constant state of tension, knowing the Lightning could appear suddenly from above or out of the sun. This anxiety was familiar even before the P-38 entered the conflict. Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Nakajima described an encounter with a pair of F-4F Wildcats in which coordinated teamwork forced him into retreat. He managed to position himself behind one American fighter only to be ambushed by its partner sweeping in from the side. He returned to Rabaul enraged and humiliated. Yet such challenges were minor compared to what the Lightning would soon impose.
Even Saburo Sakai, perhaps the most celebrated of Japan's fighter aces, would eventually concede that Zeros could seldom defeat P-38s except under exceptionally rare and favorable circumstances. His acknowledgement carried immense symbolic force. If Japan's most accomplished pilot believed the challenge insurmountable, many younger aviators saw little chance of prevailing. In operational terms, the situation was even more dire than individual combat encounters suggested. With drop tanks extending its operational radius to roughly 1,600 miles, the Lightning could appear over nearly any corner of the Pacific theater. Long-range escort missions that had once been impossible were now routine. Japanese pilots, who had previously relied on the advantage of defending familiar territory with superior numbers, increasingly found themselves outflanked and outranged. Operation Vengeance, a turning point.
The most dramatic display of the P-38's capabilities came on April 18, 1943, during Operation Vengeance, the mission to intercept and kill Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. 16 Lightnings set out on a 435-mile overwater approach, flying at wave-top height to remain undetected. Led by Major John Mitchell, the formation maintained extreme navigational precision before climbing sharply to strike at precisely the right moment. The attack unfolded with devastating efficiency. Yamamoto's transport aircraft, accompanied by 6 Zero escorts, was caught during its descent to land, a moment when speed and maneuverability were limited. The escorting pilots later described how the American fighters seemed to materialize suddenly, deliver their attack, and withdraw before the Zeros could mount an organized defense. Kenji Yanaga, one of the escort flyers, recalled the disbelief among his comrades as they witnessed American fighters operating not only at the limits of their range, but with a tactical discipline Japan was increasingly unable to emulate. The psychological blow to Japanese naval aviation was immense. Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and one of Japan's most revered military leaders, had been hunted down with clockwork precision. The feat underscored a hard truth. American air power was advancing at a pace Japan could no longer match. Tactical shifts and operational dominance. Throughout 1943, U.S. pilots refined methods that capitalized on the Lightning's inherent strengths. The boom and zoom approach, diving from altitude, attacking with speed, then climbing out of reach, became standard doctrine. Against this tactic, Zero pilots found themselves with few effective counters. The very first recorded encounter between Japanese forces and the P-38 resulted in 15 Japanese aircraft destroyed at the cost of only 1 Lightning, a pattern that increasingly characterized later clashes. Japanese units experimented with multiple defensive ideas, deploying dive breaks to force overshoots, attempting to drag P-38s into tight turning fights at low altitude, and developing looser formations to improve early detection. None of these adjustments reliably changed the outcome. The fundamental performance gap remained too wide. Industrial strength behind the aircraft. Behind the P-38's battlefield success lay an industrial engine Japan could not hope to rival. American factories produced more than 10,000 Lightnings across 18 major variants, each incorporating improvements derived directly from combat experience. Adjustments to cooling systems, armament reliability, engine performance, and aerodynamics were introduced continuously, often while earlier models were still in frontline service. To Japanese pilots, the impression was of an enemy whose aircraft seemed to evolve faster than they could adapt. By the later stages of the war, the P-38 had become not merely a superior fighter, but a symbol of the overwhelming industrial and technological momentum that was reshaping the Pacific conflict. Its reach, power, and adaptability announced a new era of air warfare, one in which Japan's early war advantages had been decisively overtaken. When the P-38J entered service near the end of 1943, it represented a significant step forward in the Lightning's evolution. Engineers had fitted the aircraft with hydraulically assisted ailerons, giving pilots a noticeably sharper roll response, an advantage that earlier versions lacked in high-speed maneuvers. Persistent cockpit temperature problems that had troubled aircrews in the European theater were also finally brought under control. In addition, refinements to the turbo supercharger system pushed the fighter's high-altitude performance beyond what American pilots had previously experienced with the type. On the opposite side of the Pacific, Japanese designers were facing far greater difficulties. Attempts to squeeze more capability out of the aging Zero airframe were producing only marginal results. Captain Minoru Genda, credited as one of the principal tactical minds behind the attack on Pearl Harbor, confided to fellow officers in the middle of 1943 that Japan was falling behind in a way that went deeper than a simple comparison of airplanes. Quote, "We are not merely confronting a better fighter," he lamented. "We are confronted by a relentless process of refinement, one model after another, that we cannot equal." This widening technological gap was compounded by an even more critical issue: pilot proficiency.
By mid-1943, the Imperial forces were losing seasoned flyers at a rate far beyond their ability to train replacements. Training pipelines that had once lasted nearly 2 years were shortened brutally to a few months. New fighters were being delivered to frontline units with barely 150 to 200 hours of flight time and minimal exposure to advanced combat techniques. American airmen, by contrast, were entering war zones with double or even triple that experience. Many had accumulated 400 to 600 hours before ever facing an enemy aircraft. They had practiced against instructors in simulated engagements, reviewed real gun camera footage, and learned to transition smoothly between different aircraft types. Upon moving to the P-38, they received specialized preparation for twin-engine management, high-altitude engagements, and the unique tactical opportunities the Lightning offered. The mechanical layout of the P-38, specifically its twin-engine configuration, gave it a life-saving edge. Lightnings routinely returned to base on a single functioning engine, even after sustaining heavy battle damage. This reliability had a profound psychological effect, especially when contrasted with the situation of Japanese aviators. Zero pilots, operating alone over thousands of miles of ocean in single-engine machines stripped of armor and lacking self-sealing fuel tanks, knew that an engine failure or a well-placed bullet meant almost certain death, or a desperate struggle in dangerous seas. The range that had once been the Zero's signature strength was now inseparable from its vulnerabilities. By late 1943, the Japanese intelligence apparatus was issuing increasingly urgent warnings. Reports circulated among fighter groups advising aviators to avoid direct confrontation with P-38s whenever possible. Analysts highlighted the American fighter's extraordinary diving ability, its precision in combat, and its uncanny tendency to appear without warning. A captured document dated December 1943 described the Lightning as the most dangerous American fighter currently encountered in the Pacific, and recommended that pilots break off engagements unless they held overwhelming positional and numerical superiority. For a military culture built upon aggressive, honor-bound aerial combat, this formal instruction to disengage struck at the heart of its identity. The psychological toll was immediate and severe. Pilots who had been raised to attack at every opportunity were now told that retreat was often the wisest course. The performance of American aces only reinforced the reality. Major Richard or Dick Bong, flying exclusively in P-38s, achieved 40 confirmed victories, becoming the United States' top-scoring ace. Major Thomas B. McGuire, another Lightning specialist, amassed 38 victories before his death in early 1945. Their achievements underscored not just individual skill, but the broader effectiveness of the aircraft and the systems of training, production, and innovation that supported it.
In less than 2 years of continuous operations, American pilots flying the P-38 Lightning amassed victory scores that surpassed what many Japanese veterans had achieved only after 3 or even 4 years of fighting. By the end of the campaign, more than 1,800 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed by P-38s in the Pacific. This number reflected more than machines lost. It represented a collapse in Japan's pool of seasoned aviators, men whose experience could not be regenerated by the struggling training system. Each P-38 victory chipped away at Japan's air strength at a rate the Imperial forces could no longer compensate for. Technological momentum. Throughout 1944, while Japan's aircraft development slowed and eventually stalled, the P-38 continued receiving upgrades that pushed its performance further ahead. The P-38L variant emerged with stronger high-altitude engines, redesigned cooling units, and provisions for rocket armament that turned the aircraft into an efficient ground attack platform. These Lightnings could haul impressive bomb loads in addition to their standard guns, transforming them from pure fighters into flexible strike aircraft. Japanese airmen watching these transformations unfold gradually realized that the Lightning was not merely a fast or heavily armed opponent. It had evolved into an adaptable weapons system, capable of dominating the skies one moment and demolishing ground targets the next. This versatility produced a psychological shock that compounded the tactical challenge they already faced. Doctrinal and cultural divide. Beyond technology, there was a profound difference in how the two nations approached aerial warfare. Japanese doctrine treated air combat as an arena for individual skill, agility, and martial spirit, traits deeply rooted in the nation's warrior tradition. The United States, by contrast, approached the problem analytically, relying on engineering, coordinated tactics, and continuous refinement based on real-world engagements. Commander Masatake Okumiya, who later reviewed wartime reports, admitted that post-war Japanese analysts struggled to accept a hard truth. Determination alone could not make up for shortcomings in aircraft performance and tactical doctrine. Reports highlighting the Lightning's strengths were frequently dismissed or met with calls for increased boldness rather than practical adaptation. According to Okumiya, Japan conflated bravery with capability, an error that made meaningful reform nearly impossible. While American flyers routinely revised their methods based on evolving combat data, Japanese squadrons continued to emphasize aerobatics and personal dueling skills, attributes that mattered little when the enemy refused to engage on those terms.
The radar shift. By mid-1944, certain P-38 units were equipped with rudimentary airborne radar for nighttime operations. Though primitive by later standards, this technology represented a capability Japan simply did not possess. The night sky, once a reliable refuge for Japanese aircraft movements, no longer guaranteed safety. The reach of the Lightning was extending into hours the Japanese had previously assumed the Americans could not contest. Indirect impact on the Philippine Sea. The P-38 was not present over the Philippine Sea during the June 1944 carrier clashes, yet its influence was felt in another way. The years-long attritional pressure from P-38s and other American fighters had steadily removed Japan's experienced flyers from the battlefield. Thus, when Japanese carrier pilots faced the Navy's Hellcats, they entered the fight with insufficient training and almost no combat-seasoned leaders. In what became known as the Marianas Turkey Shoot, more than 300 Japanese aircraft were shot down for minimal American losses. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa later reflected that his aircrews arrived unprepared, lacking both skill and capable aircraft, a situation shaped by years of cumulative defeats long before the battle began. Escalating desperation. As the war entered its final phase between 1944 and 1945, Japanese efforts to counter the Lightning grew increasingly extreme. Some units encouraged ramming tactics as a last resort, acknowledging that conventional dogfighting had become futile. Specialized phosphorus anti-aircraft munitions were designed to ignite the P-38's fuel tanks. Japan also attempted to field its own twin-engine fighters, hoping to create something comparable to the Lightning's range and stability. The Kawasaki K-102 was the closest realization of that effort, but it revealed the depth of the technological divide. Whereas the P-38 had been a frontline fighter since 1941, the K-102 only entered service in 1945, and fewer than 250 airframes were ever completed. It was slower, climbed less effectively, and suffered from persistent mechanical difficulties. None of Japan's twin-engine projects appeared in enough numbers or with sufficiently reliable performance to alter the strategic situation. The collapse of Japanese air superiority. By the last year of the war, Japan's ability to contest the air had effectively ended. The P-38, through its combination of speed, firepower, versatility, and relentless attritional pressure, played a major role in this outcome. What began as a duel between fighters gradually evolved into a systematic dismantling of Japan's entire aerial capability. By the time surrender approached, the Imperial Air Arm faced an opponent it could no longer match in technology, doctrine, or depth of experience, an imbalance that the Lightning had helped accelerate at every turn. By the opening months of 1945, Japanese aviators no longer discussed controlling the skies, nor even maintaining equality with their opponents. Their conversations had narrowed to a single concern: staying alive. The P-38 Lightning, working alongside other American fighter types, had achieved such overwhelming effectiveness that Japanese pilots regarded the air above their own homeland as hostile territory. Ace pilot Saburo Sakai would later remark that the P-38 effectively crushed the psychological resilience of Zero fighter crews. Operational records support his assessment. The combat history of the Lightning in the Pacific forms a consistent narrative of dominance. More than 1,800 Japanese aircraft were confirmed destroyed by P-38 units. Major Richard Bong earned all 40 of his victories in the type, making him America's top-scoring ace, while Major Thomas McGuire recorded 38, also flying P-38s. No other U.S. Army Air Force's fighter platform matched the Lightning's tally of enemy aircraft downed. Japanese losses painted an even darker picture. By the closing days of the war, Japan had lost well over 90% of the battle-tested aviators who had taken to the air in 1941. The newcomers arriving at airfields in 1945 typically possessed fewer than 100 hours of flight time. Rather than seasoned combatants, they were undertrained replacements being sent into situations for which they had no realistic chance of success. Insights after the war. In the aftermath of Japan's capitulation, U.S. occupation authorities conducted detailed interrogations of surviving pilots and commanders. These discussions revealed how deeply the P-38 had shaken Japanese confidence. Commander Masatake Okumiya acknowledged that the Lightning undermined their belief in both their equipment and their training, admitting, "The P-38 destroyed our certainty. What we assumed was superior proved not to be. It wasn't only faster or more heavily armed, its entire design philosophy represented an approach to air combat we could not counter." Another pilot recalled his first encounter with the aircraft, noting his astonishment at seeing an American fighter capable of outperforming the Zero in every major aspect: speed, climb, and dive, despite the Zero's legendary reputation within Japan as the world's premier dogfighter.
Technical comparisons. Post-war engineering assessments further clarified the extent of the technological divide. The Mitsubishi A6M20, remarkable at the war's outset, reached roughly 332 miles per hour at altitude and had a service ceiling of around 33,000 feet, though its performance deteriorated significantly above 25,000 feet. Its climb rate, initially about 3,100 feet per minute, diminished sharply with height. The aircraft's long range, nearly 1,930 miles, was extraordinary for its era, but its protection was almost non-existent. Early versions lacked armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. Armament consisted of two 7.7mm machine guns and a pair of 20mm cannon with limited ammunition supply. By contrast, the Lockheed P-38L Lightning surpassed 400 miles per hour, reached altitudes near 44,000 feet, and climbed at roughly 4,750 feet per minute at sea level. With drop tanks, its range approached 1,600 miles. Its weaponry, four 50-caliber machine guns paired with a 20mm cannon, provided dense, accurate fire. It carried extensive armor and employed self-sealing fuel tanks as standard equipment. When placed side by side, the two designs represented different eras of aviation thinking. The Zero belonged to a doctrine where agility and pilot skill determined victory, while the Lightning embodied an industrial, technology-driven conception of warfare. Industrial foundations. The P-38's advantages were inseparable from the industrial machinery behind it. Lockheed built over 10,000 Lightnings during the conflict, produced with assembly line precision rooted in America's automotive manufacturing expertise. Although Japan manufactured a similar total number of Zeros over a longer period, the quality of later models declined as materials and experienced labor became scarce. Each Lightning required thousands of components manufactured to high tolerances, something the Japanese industrial network struggled to match.
The Allison engines powering the P-38, equipped with sophisticated superchargers and produced using advanced metallurgical processes, embodied levels of mechanical standardization that Japanese factories could not replicate. While Japanese engines often needed hand-fitting and experienced frequent inconsistencies, American power plants were largely interchangeable, allowing faster repairs and consistent field performance. The training divide. By 1944, disparities in pilot preparation had widened into a vast gulf. U.S. aviators assigned to the P-38 typically completed more than 100 hours of twin-engine training before transitioning to the aircraft itself. They were drilled extensively in procedures for engine-out situations, asymmetric thrust control, high-altitude operations, oxygen system use, gunnery with towed targets and camera guns, formation tactics, and mutual support doctrines. They also underwent survival and escape training and were expected to master the aircraft's systems in detail. Japanese pilot instruction during the same period had become rudimentary. Many trainees logged only 50 to 100 hours of basic flight practice, with minimal exposure to air combat maneuvering or gunnery. Shortages of ammunition limited live fire training. High-altitude instruction was largely absent, and as Japan shifted towards special attack missions, greater emphasis was placed on personal resolve and sacrifice than on tactical proficiency. The consequences were inevitable. American pilots typically entered combat as well-prepared professionals, while many Japanese pilots in 1944 to 1945 were young men with insufficient experience sent into an air war that had already passed them by.
Tactical transformation. The arrival of the P-38 triggered a complete rethinking of how air battles were fought in the Pacific. The slow, circling engagements that had defined aerial combat since the First World War no longer offered any advantage. Although the P-38 struggled to match the tight turning radius of the A-6M0 at low speeds, particularly under 200 miles per hour, its exceptional velocity and strong climb rate allowed American pilots to treat altitude and speed as their primary weapons. U.S. aviators refined a tactic that came to be known as the high side attack. Starting from a superior height and offset position, they swept down across Japanese formations, unleashed short bursts of fire, and then vaulted back into the sky before enemy aircraft could reposition. Without the P-38's combination of power and climb efficiency, such energy-based maneuvering would not have been feasible. These rapid strike passes exposed the fragility of Japanese defensive groupings, which had been built around close-in turning contests rather than vertical maneuver warfare. Japanese commanders attempted several countermeasures. Fighters were stationed in multi-layered altitude stacks, but dispersing units vertically robbed them of mutual support. They also tried to use cloud layers for concealment, yet the P-38's high cruise speed enabled American pilots to sweep enormous patrol zones and detect isolated Japanese aircraft wherever they attempted to hide. Psychological effects. Beyond its tactical influence, the P-38 introduced a powerful psychological dimension to the conflict. Its twin-boom shape, unlike anything else in the theater, initially led Japanese pilots to assume it was sluggish and vulnerable. Over time, however, the unusual outline became strongly associated with U.S. technical dominance. Many Japanese airmen admitted to feeling unease at the sight of its silhouette even before shots were fired. Ground personnel noted that rumors of P-38 activity alone could postpone Japanese sorties or force commanders to request extra escorts they could scarcely afford. The name Japanese pilots informally gave it, "two planes, one pilot," captured both their confusion about its odd geometry and their reluctant respect for its effectiveness.
Strategic consequences. The edge the P-38 provided went far beyond individual dogfights. Japan's pre-war planning assumed that parity in aircraft performance combined with a belief in superior martial spirit would offset numerical disadvantages.
The P-38's performance proved that technology could create a gap so wide that personal courage no longer mattered. This recognition contributed to several major Japanese decisions: an increase in kamikaze operations once conventional engagements became unwinnable, withdrawing the few remaining veteran pilots to defend the home islands, ending most offensive air operations by mid-1944, and funneling resources into last-ditch miracle weapon concepts. By late 1944, even senior Japanese naval leadership understood the scale of the collapse. Admiral Somu Toyoda, head of the combined fleet, privately acknowledged in October that Japan no longer possessed an air arm capable of traditional operations, and that American fighters, most notably the P-38, had stripped Japan of its ability to challenge Allied air supremacy. Logistical and maintenance advantage. Despite its twin-engine complexity, the P-38 became a showcase for another American strength: industrial-scale maintenance and logistics. Squadrons operating in harsh Pacific environments routinely reported readiness levels above 80%. Meanwhile, Japanese fighter units flying comparatively simple single-engine aircraft struggled to keep even half their planes serviceable by 1944. A significant factor was personnel. U.S. ground crews, many trained in civilian aviation or the automotive sector, introduced methodical maintenance regimens, specialized tooling, standardized part handling, and preventative inspection routines. Japanese crews, relying heavily on individual craftsmanship and lacking systematic support structures, could not keep pace with the mechanical demands of sustained combat. Navigation and operational reach. Navigation technology created yet another gap. P-38s carried radio direction-finding gear that allowed pilots to traverse immense stretches of open ocean, locate bases in poor weather, and synchronize long-range strikes with precision. Japanese airmen, still dependent on dead reckoning and visual cues, faced strict limits on how far and how flexibly they could operate. This disparity became dramatically clear during missions such as the interception of Admiral Yamamoto's aircraft. The operation required exact timing and navigation over more than 400 miles of featureless sea, conditions nearly impossible for Japanese pilots to manage with their existing equipment. The P-38, however, possessed both the range and the navigational tools to carry out such a demanding assignment successfully.
The impact on Japanese naval aviation. The Imperial Japanese Navy had constructed its entire wartime strategy on the assumption that carrier-based air power would determine the outcome of any major conflict. This foundation began to erode rapidly once the P-38 Lightning appeared in large numbers over the Pacific. Air groups that were being reconstituted after the catastrophic losses at Midway suffered further attrition during the island-hopping campaigns, where P-38s, alongside other modern American fighters, repeatedly cut them down. By 1944, Japanese carriers sailed into combat zones with air complements that were often half of their intended size and staffed by aviators whose training was abbreviated and insufficient. Vice Admiral Jizaburo Ozawa, commander of the 1st Mobile Fleet, delivered a bleak assessment before the Battle of the Philippine Sea. His aviators, he warned, were barely capable of basic carrier operations and stood almost no chance against experienced American pilots flying machines like the P-38 or the F-6F Hellcat. He openly admitted that many would not return. A shift in military culture. The encounter with the Lightning also brought about a deeper institutional reckoning. For decades, Japan's armed forces had upheld a warrior ethos rooted in Bushido, a belief system that emphasized perseverance, bravery, and the superiority of individual fighting spirit. Yet this ideology proved insufficient when confronted with the industrialized, technology-driven warfare practiced by the United States. Young officers who witnessed the mismatch firsthand began to question the intellectual foundations of Japanese doctrine. Their doubts spread beyond the military sphere.
The few pilots who survived repeated engagements returned with accounts that contradicted years of nationalist propaganda. They described American aircraft whose performance was so advanced that no amount of spiritual resolve could compensate. These stories quietly influenced broader cultural debates within Japan about modernity, science, and the limits of traditionalism. Economic constraints and industrial reality. The P-38 program itself represented an industrial capability Japan simply could not replicate. A single Lightning cost roughly $97,000 in 1944, a considerable sum even for the United States. But American factories produced thousands without difficulty. Japan, in contrast, struggled to manufacture simpler aircraft in useful quantities. The aluminum consumed by one P-38 exceeded what many Japanese plants received in an entire month during the later stages of the war. Critical components, precision instruments, advanced turbo superchargers, reliable constant-speed propellers were far beyond what Japanese industry could mass produce at the time. Every P-38 delivered to the Pacific underscored the widening industrial gulf between the two nations. Testimonies from the pilots themselves. Perhaps the most revealing evidence of the Lightning's influence comes from Japanese aviators who spoke about their wartime experiences after 1945. These were men trained never to acknowledge inferiority, yet in interviews they consistently described the P-38 as overwhelmingly superior. Ace pilot Saburo Sakai noted that the Lightning typically roamed at altitudes unreachable for the Zero. From those heights, he explained, P-38 pilots could dive with extraordinary speed, initiate combat on their terms, and break away safely before Japanese fighters could respond. To him and others, the Zero felt hopelessly outmatched whenever the Lightning appeared overhead. A blow to morale, the reconnaissance advantage. The greatest embarrassment, however, had little to do with dogfights. Photo reconnaissance variants of the P-38, particularly the F-5 models, conducted Allied aerial photography throughout the Pacific and were responsible for nearly 90% of the imagery used for strategic planning. These unarmed Lightnings, stripped of guns to reduce weight, retained the full performance of the fighter versions. They mapped Japanese airfields, fortifications, supply depots, and troop concentrations with near total impunity. Japan's fighters struggled even to climb to the altitudes where F-5s operated. Interception attempts often ended before they began. Japanese commanders came to understand that their movements were continuously observed, recorded, and analyzed by the same aircraft that dominated them in combat. Long-term effects and post-war reflections. The shock experienced by Japanese pilots reverberated long after the conflict ended. Their encounters with technologically superior aircraft played a role in shaping Japan's post-war attitude towards science, engineering, and industrial productivity. Many surviving aviators, having witnessed the consequences of falling behind, became outspoken supporters of technological modernization in the following decades. Saburo Sakai, who transitioned into a successful business career, frequently referenced the lessons he had drawn from facing the P-38. The Lightning, he argued, demonstrated that valor alone no longer decided battles. In modern warfare, national survival depended on industrial competence and continuous innovation. The race of technical progress. The P-38's wartime progression illustrated another American advantage, the capacity to rapidly refine a design in response to frontline feedback. Issues uncovered during combat operations were addressed in successive production versions. Aerodynamic problems in high-speed dives led to the introduction of dive flaps. Uncomfortable cockpit temperatures resulted in improved heating, and handling complaints were mitigated with hydraulically boosted ailerons. Japanese aviation development, restricted by scarce materials, limited manufacturing capacity, and conservative decision-making, struggled to keep pace. By the end of the war, the A6M-0 differed only modestly from its 1941 configuration.
In contrast, the P-38L entering service in 1945 bore little resemblance in performance or capability to the early P-38E that had first reached the Pacific. The definitive evaluation of the P-38 Lightning in the Pacific Theater. General George Kenney, who commanded the Allied Air Forces in the Southwest Pacific, remarked on the extraordinary operational advantage of the P-38 Lightning. Its pilots could dictate the terms of combat from extreme altitudes, choosing the moment and location to engage with devastating effectiveness against Japanese aircraft. This capacity to control the engagement represented a profound transformation in aerial warfare, one that Japanese doctrine was never able to counter effectively. The statistical record confirms the scale of this advantage. By the conclusion of the war, the two highest-scoring American aces had collectively downed 78 Japanese planes, all while flying P-38s. In contrast, the leading surviving Japanese ace accumulated 64 victories over a period of 6 years. These figures highlight an attrition rate that Japan could not sustain.
Strategic and technological implications. The superiority of the P-38 over the Mitsubishi A6M0 was not merely a demonstration of better engineering. It revealed deep contrasts in military philosophy, industrial organization, technological innovation, cultural outlook, and strategic planning. Japan had prepared for a brief, decisive conflict, relying on the valor and fighting spirit of its aviators to offset material shortcomings. The United States, by contrast, anticipated a protracted, industrial-scale war in which technological sophistication and production capacity would dictate outcomes. Japanese pilots encountering the P-38 often described a profound psychological impact. The shock was less about a single machine than about facing the full weight of modern technological warfare. The Lightning symbolized the systematic integration of scientific research, engineering excellence, and large-scale industrial management into combat operations, a combination that traditional samurai ethos, however valorous, could not withstand. Human cost. Beyond statistics and performance charts lay a staggering human toll. Thousands of young Japanese aviators, many with fewer than 100 flight hours, were sent to confront P-38s in increasingly outdated aircraft. They were acutely aware of their slim chances for survival. Personal letters recovered after the war provide poignant evidence of resignation and courage in the face of inevitable death. One pilot wrote to his mother before a fatal sortie in March 1944 over Rabaul. He acknowledged the superiority of the twin-tailed devils and accepted the hopelessness of his mission. His fate, like that of countless others, underscores the human consequences of a technological gulf that skill and bravery alone could not bridge. Long-term influence. The P-38 Lightning's legacy extended well beyond World War II. Its performance informed the design of Cold War-era interceptors, prompting both the United States and the Soviet Union to prioritize twin-engine, high-altitude fighter capabilities. The principle of leveraging technological advantage to achieve overwhelming combat effectiveness became central to U.S. military doctrine. For Japan, the encounter with the P-38 prompted a post-war focus on fewer, more advanced aircraft, emphasizing quality over quantity. The experience left an indelible mark on Japanese military thinking, instilling an acute awareness of the consequences of technological inferiority. The end of the warrior pilot era. For Japanese aviators, the emergence of the P-38 signaled the end of an era in which individual skill, daring maneuvers, and personal courage could determine air combat outcomes. The Zero, which had once epitomized Japanese air superiority, was rendered obsolete by 1943. The aircraft itself was fast, agile, and deadly, but it also symbolized a new mode of warfare, one in which industrial output, systematic innovation, and technological mastery outweighed tradition and individual valor. Saburo Sakai, Japan's most celebrated fighter ace, later reflected on how the Lightning crushed the morale of Zero pilots. It was not simply a matter of speed or climb rate, it was the realization that the framework of Japanese air combat had been decisively surpassed. Conclusion. The P-38 Lightning's role in the Pacific Theater represents a turning point in modern aerial warfare. It revealed that courage without technological parity is insufficient and that strategic outcomes are increasingly dictated by industrial capacity and engineering ingenuity. The aircraft did more than shoot down enemy planes. It dismantled long-held beliefs about honor, combat, and national power. Japanese pilots who confronted the P-38 came to understand the stark reality. The age of the individual warrior, the era of the samurai in the skies, had ended. In its place rose the industrialized, technology-driven warfare of the 20th century, where a nation's capacity to innovate and produce proved decisive. The P-38 Lightning was not just an aircraft, it was the embodiment of American industrial might and the forewarning of a new era in military history. For Japan, the cost of this revelation was measured in the lives of its young pilots, the loss of aircraft, and the erosion of dreams for regional dominance. The twin-tailed devils that haunted the Pacific skies were ultimately a testament to the triumph of modern warfare over tradition.